there was the longer-term plans to privatize Iraq's oil and the hope that this would spread to surrounding countries because Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, these are all highly protected economies. And in fact, this is the one part of the world besides North Korea that really exists outside of the so-called Washington consensus. I mean, these are highly, even U.S. allies in the region like Saudi Arabia, 90% of that economy is controlled by the monarchy. This is not a free market economy. So, there were there were ideas that there would be a tsunami of oil privatization, and papers written by the American Enterprise Institute at the time explaining this. So, but the third level of privatization was inside the military itself, and this was a huge part of Rumsfeld's transformation vision. And on September the 10th, 2001, on that fateful day, Donald Rumsfeld unveiled this plan in a town hall meeting at the Pentagon, an extraordinarily controversial speech that he made where he declared war on the Pentagon bureaucracy and unveiled a vision for a sort of hollow military. And it was basically, he went in there like a sort of new economy CEO that was saying, we're not going to produce products anymore, we're going to produce brands, and we're going to outsource everything. And this is what he was saying to the Pentagon bureaucracy. He was saying, why are we sorting our own mail? Why do we have doctors treating soldiers when this can be done by private companies? And he had a huge list of things that were being done in-house that he believed could be done by private companies. And let's remember that he spent 2.5 decades in the private sector. I argue that he was very much a card-carrying member of what I'm calling the disaster capitalism complex. He was chair of the board of Gilead Sciences, which is a company that produces AIDS drugs and Tamiflu, which is the treatment of choice for avian flu, which is, in other words, it's a company that actually profits from the threat of disaster and pandemic. And, he had a vision. He had this vision of the hollow state. Cheney, was somebody else who, in his role in the private sector, was at the forefront of this radical vision of the hollow state. And he was doing that at Halliburton, the hollowing out of the sort of the military campaign in the Balkans. You had the first stage of what we've seen in Iraq with the fully privatized bases kind of run as Halliburton city-states. So what I'm arguing in the book is that Plan A was, in fact, to turn Iraq into a model free market economy. That was the real wish. But the project was rigged so that it couldn't fail, which is to say that when Plan A turned out to be a drastic miscalculation and Iraqis rejected this and the insurgency began, that because the privatization ethos had entered the heart of the invasion itself under Rumsfeld, where you had a very downsized army surrounded by contractors, and as things got worse in Iraq and Rumsfeld refused to send more troops, that meant that contractors filled the gap, and you had this very dramatic mission creep that we're continuing to see. This is part of what I'm arguing is the shock doctrine, because that crisis created a context where there wasn't a debate about whether private contractors should be involved in interrogation, or whether
In fact, nobody has any clue about the extent of really the private operation that exists alongside the army in Iraq at this point, right?
Well, in fact, we get glimpses of it only through scandal. This is what's really quite remarkable, is that this agenda that was pushed through after September 11th, and then in the crisis as the war in Iraq went off the rails. If you read the New York Times or the Washington Post and the reports on what's going on with Blackwater in Iraq, you hear, there are between 20,000 and 48,000 private security firms, private security soldiers in Iraq. Well, how many? I mean, why is there such a gap between, there could be even more. We don't have any accurate count. So what we're finding out is, this was never debated. There was never a public discussion about something as crucial. Security, the fact that it's the government's job to provide security, that's a constitutional mandate. So there was never this debate, and we find out about this corporate mission creep scandal by scandal. So during the Abu Ghraib scandal, we find out that it wasn't just soldiers who were involved, there were private contractors who were involved in the interrogation. And when there's a shootout in Baghdad and the Iraqi government says they want to ban Blackwater, we find out, the extent of Blackwater's involvement there.
The reason that we rely so heavily on contractors in Iraq, it's not, I can see that it looks kind of dodgy that you have these conflicts of interest where you have somebody like Cheney coming out of Halliburton, you have Halliburton profiting off of the war. But it seems to me that more than the profit motive, I don't think that's terribly significant. It seems to me that this is a lot of times sleight of hand, that there's been a reluctance to sell, to be straight with the American public about the cost of war. And so you don't want to have a high troop level because it makes the war seem more burdensome than it actually is. And that the reliance on contractors, there's some ideological component to it, but there's also a public relations component to it.
I think there's also an ideological component to it. And I think if we look at who the key figures of this administration are, and also the key figures who demanded this war most loudly, they are embedded in this economy of disaster. And Dick Cheney and his wife on the board of Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin in the 90s was the major engine of this vision of a hollow government. When Clinton slashed military spending, and Lockheed and other weapons companies started to see that they needed to diversify because their main area was shrinking. Their main market was shrinking. Where Lockheed started to diversify was saying to the government, okay, we already have security clearance, so there's all kinds of functions that you're performing that we could do. So Lockheed starts sorting the mail, cutting welfare checks, performing core government functions, and this hollowing out of the government was really being pushed by that company. Halliburton was doing the same thing on the military end. So I'm saying it's both ideological and it's financial. I mean, this seems clear to me.
So you're saying
for those personal people, Dick Cheney with his massive Halliburton holdings, do you think he's doing it for charity? I mean, I'm really mystified that we think such wonderful things about
I don't think
figures.
wonderful things about them, but I think that maybe he drank the Kool-Aid when he was at these...
Yeah, but the Kool-Aid was also really profitable. I mean, these things are simultaneous because you have an ideology that conveniently is a justification for greed. I mean, the ideology is pursue your greed, feed economic growth, and everything will be fixed in the trickle-down. Like, I can't separate the ideology from the self-interest.
But I also see a lot of other people who were prime architects of the war who didn't have this financial incentive. Somebody like Wolfowitz or Bill Kristol or George W. Bush, I don't think especially, right? He
has very close family holdings to Carlyle, which is a major weapons company, and he's very close to the oil industry. And if we look at who's actually benefited from this war, it's the military companies, it's the contractors who are doing the heavy reconstruction, and it's the oil industry, which didn't get their oil boom in Iraq, but they got it in every other part of the world.
Well, it seems like
because the price of oil has gone up to $75.
But it's been a flop for these guys on a lot of levels. I mean, their reputations are ruined. It's somebody like Rumsfeld. It's hard to know what he's going to do. Well,
he's starting a think tank about the connection between security and free market economics.
Right. All right. QED.
All right.
And just for the economy in general, it's not been.
Exactly, but I really do think that when we say this has been a failure, this has been a disaster, we need to ask for who. Because for Halliburton, for Lockheed, for Gilead Sciences, for the key, for Bechtel, another figure who was really very prominent in beating the drums of war.
You're talking about a very narrow sector of the whole economy, but one in which...
But I'm talking about the people who really created the case for this war. I mean, the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq was created by a former vice president of Lockheed Martin who didn't have to sell his shares. George Shultz was the chair of that committee, and he was on the board of Bechtel the whole time. So, yeah, I realize it seems simplistic and obvious, but I believe that
I'm going to have to cut you off because we're going to have to take a quick break, but we will, after the break, resume this discussion.
Wonderful.
Afterwards and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Naomi Klein and Franklin Foer in a moment.